This is Mrs. Terry, and we're back for the second section of our PowerPoint review. And I believe it stopped at clubbing on the first video. So I'm going to start at clubbing, and we've talked about that at length, where you will see it in smokers. It's from poor oxygenation. We've also talked about some accessory structures, and this one is on glands. We have the sebaceous glands and the oil glands. And the oil glands, you see that's in red, they secrete sebum. You need to know where they are, what their function is. And then you have the sweat glands, and you need to know where they are and what their function is. You have the apocrine, the eccrine, and the ceruminous. The ceruminous are the earwax. So I think I have sent you things you need to know, and apocrine I know is on there. And this is a very important page for you. The apocrine is usually associated with hair follicles. It's more active at puberty. And they are exocrine glands. You need to know that. They occur under our arms and genital areas. There's sediferous glands. Then you have the eccrine glands. They're critical for temperature regulation. And you have types of modified sweat glands. You have the mammary glands, which secrete the milk to help feed our babies. And the ceruminous glands, which I told you secrete the earwax. This is also a very important page for you to know. You need to study this stuff. So key terms in body temperature are core temperature. That's the inner parts of our body, what we check with rectal temperatures. You'll hear the physicians talk about core temperature, and that's temperatures that are the inner parts of our body. Shell temperature, that's the surface area, and thermoregulation means the balance of heat production and heat loss. So if something is affecting the thermoregulation, then their temperature can go way high up. The normal body temperature is 97 to 100, and excessive would be hyperthermia. So if you have a real high temperature, you're hyperthermic. If you have a low temperature, you're hypothermic. Remember, high and low. Hypo and hyper. Hyper means high. Hypo means low. And core temperature is usually rectally. Shell and the others are measured at the axillary site or orally. Heat production is metabolism. That's the basis of our body temperature. And we have metabolizing cells that produce the body temperature. Blood disperses heat throughout the body. Most heat is produced by muscles, you know, when you exercise and you get really hot. Also by the liver and endocrine glands. And it is also affected by food consumption, hormones, a disease, and like I said, physical activity. The hormonal could be if you have a thyroid problem, and then often one of your symptoms are you're very hot. So that's a hormonal issue, and it can be if you have a thyroid disorder also. Let's see. Heat loss, you lose 80% through your skin, and you lose 20% through your lungs and excretory glands. Now, you have types of radiation. Types of heat. You have radiation heat. You have conduction, convection, you know, like a convection oven. And you have heat through evaporation, sweating. You need to know these. Radiation means that the heat is lost from a warm object, which is the body, to the cooler air surrounding the warm object. So if you're sitting out at a football game, you're losing your heat to that cooler air surrounding you. Conduction, as I told you, that is the way many of our ovens now are. Convection. Conduction is a cooling blanket that you use to treat hyperthermia, high temperature. You use a cooling blanket, and that's known as conduction. And an example of convection is the use of a fan to cool the body. And in convection ovens, it's a fan, evaporation. Why do most people feel so uncomfortable on a hot and humid day? That's a question in the notes. And humidity prevents evaporation, so less heat is carried away from the skin. So when you go out on a humid day, you just can't get enough evaporation going, which helps cool you, and that's why you're so hot. Temperature regulation is called thermoregulation. The hypothalamus is our body's thermostat. That's in our brain, right there. In the little part of our brain is our body thermoregulator. Heat is lost by dilation of the blood vessels and sweating. And you remember that babies don't sweat. And so that's why it is so dangerous to put a baby in a hot car or somewhere out in the heat. I see them all the time out in the heat at ball games, which is ridiculous because infants don't sweat. And so their temperature can rise rapidly without you even knowing it. Heat is conserved by shivering, and that's why we shiver, is because our body is telling us we need to warm up. Our vessels constrict and we don't sweat. This is a very important slide for you to study. Newborns, I just talked about that. They have a large surface area, a little bald head. They have less insulation, and they don't shiver. So that's why their temperature can go up or down. They have limited capacity to dissipate heat, and therefore they're at risk for hyperthermia. And that's why we put hats on them in the nursery to protect their little heads and keep that heat in. And preterm infants have even less capacity to thermoregulate, so they're often in the little incubators, and that's why they're in the incubator. Normothermia is normal. Pyrexia means fever. Hyperthermia, we talked about, is fever. Hypo means your temperature is low. And there are a lot of notes on there about that, so look those up. I'm not going to go over them today. Now, I have covered at least the first 8 items on the blueprint, and you can see that we've talked about in the blueprint the functions of melanocytes. We've talked about modified sweat glands, such as the ceruminous glands, the ones that do earwax. We've talked about heat loss in those terms. Modified sweat gland, we've talked about the types. Heat regulation and sweating, and how is that related? How is sweating related to heat regulation? We've talked about the layers of the skin and their function, and we've talked about apocrine glands, and we've talked about the heat regulator in the brain. Now, I expect you all to know all of that. We've also talked about the glands in the skin, which is down in 25, loss of hair, which is 27, changes in the skin color, terms and causes. We've talked about body temperature, how we measure it. We've talked about the erector pili muscles. That's what makes the hair on our arms stand up. We've talked about cyanosis. So we have covered at least 10 or 12 items on the blueprint. I'm looking to see if there's any more. We've talked about adipose tissue and how it plays a role. Okay, so moving on. A little bit about burns. The burns are partial thickness burns or full thickness burns. And a sunburn is a 1st-degree burn, and 3rd-degree burns are pain-free. Let me go back one. partial thickness burns or first and second degree burns. And that is this graph. It goes down to the epidermis. So that's a first degree or a second degree. Bad sunburn, a burn of your hand on the stove usually. A full thickness burn is what we call a third degree burn. And that's where it goes all the way down. And as a nurse, I've taken care of a lot of burn patients, and they are so painful. And these burns will hurt. We go by the rule of nines. Read in your book about the rule of nines. And that's when 36% of your body is burned. And I have taken care of those, and it is just awful. Eshkar, and that's the healing mechanism, and it acts like a tourniquet. And Eshkar breeds bacteria and secretes toxins, and so the patient gets debrided, what we call debrided, and that's where the Eshkar is taken off, and they usually have to go to surgery to have that done. And it helps the burn heal. You need to reduce your exposure to UV radiation. All right, so that is all of chapter 7. Let me see if I can get to chapter 14. All right, chapter 14 is the endocrine system, and be sure and look at your outcomes listed here. The endocrine system is composed of endocrine glands, and that's on figure 14.1. Let me get over there to it. And this was part of your homework, I believe. I haven't gotten to that yet, but anyway, figure 14.1, you need to know that. You need to know where all of these glands are in relation to the body. Endocrine glands secrete the chemical substance called hormones. So that is the system, and they secrete the hormones. The endocrine glands are ductless glands, remember that. That is, they secrete the hormones directly to the blood and not into the ducts. So you need to be sure you understand that. An example is the pancreas secretes a hormone called insulin into the blood, which then delivers the insulin to the cells throughout the body. An exocrine gland, such as the sweat gland that we just talked about, uses ducts or tiny tubes to carry its secretions to the surface of the body. Endocrine glands secrete hormones into the blood and not into the ducts. So that's the two difference. One's an endocrine gland and one's an exocrine gland. And the endocrine secretes them directly into the blood, not in a duct. Hormones are chemical messengers that influence or control the activities. I'm just going to read this rapidly because our time is fleeting. Hormones in the endocrine system regulate metabolic processes. They play an important role in growth and reproduction. Hormones regulate water, electrolyte balance. Hormones meet the demands of infection, trauma, stress. They're classified as proteins or steroids. They each binds to a specific target, and they bind a specific tissue called its target tissue. So please understand the role of hormones in the body. The endocrine system and its hormones help regulate metabolic processes involving carbohydrates, we talked about insulin, proteins, and fats. They also play an important role in growth and reproduction. They help regulate water, electrolytes, as we just talked about, and meet the demands of stress. The nervous system communicates through electrical signals called nerve impulses. Nerve impulses communicate information rapidly and generally achieve short-term effects. The endocrine system, in contrast, communicates these signals called hormones. So in times of stress, the nervous system conducts nerve impulses, and the endocrine system helps communicate with chemicals. So look at, as I told you, 14.1 in your textbook, and know all of these glands. The master gland is called the pituitary, and you will see it there in the brain, and you will read about it. But that is considered the master gland in the body, is the pituitary. And you hear people sometimes have tumors in their pituitary, that sort of thing. So not a good thing. Classification of the hormones are proteins, steroids, and their related secretions. The adrenal cortex and sex glands both secrete steroids and not proteins. You need to understand that. This is a big chapter, and you really need to read this and get a handle on hormones. They're targets, and that's an important concept that we just mentioned. But they each have a targeted organ that they're going to go to. A hormone has a targeted organ. Each hormone binds to a specific tissue called its target tissue. It's like a lock and key. Many target tissues result in more widespread effects. With fewer target tissues come fewer effects. A gland aims a hormone at a target. So it's just simply think about it that way. It's a gland, and it aims at a target, the kidney or the liver or the bones. The hormone activates a receptor on the cell membrane within the cell nucleus. So the hormone goes into the cell. So here's a protein hormone. It's going into the cell, and it's going to activate enzymes, which stimulate protein synthesis, and you will read about that. It's a control loop or a feedback. The organ knows by positive or negative feedback to give or stop secretions. So when it says, okay, I've had enough, that's negative. Positive, it'll say, give me more, like oxytocin. Like when you're delivering a baby, your oxytocin kicks in. And so you're saying, give me more so that I can have these contractions and have this baby. So that's a positive feedback. Biorhythms, many drugs are given at a certain time of the day. It's called your circadian rhythm. And that's a 24-hour rhythm that your body has. And so many drugs are given at a certain time of the day in order to be more effective on this circadian rhythm. And the central nervous system is psychoneurology, endocrinology. That's controlled by negative feedback loop. Example, as a level of cortisone rises in the blood to the needed level, cortisone then shuts off further secretion of ACTH. So as a level of cortisone drops, the inhibition is released. So that's what they're talking about, this negative positive feedback. So the adrenal cortex says, okay, I've had enough. I don't want any more cortisol, which is a steroid. I don't want any more, so stop. And the body knows, which I find completely fascinating, the body knows then to stop. And the same about give me more, and I already told you about the oxytocin, so you know that. The pituitary gland is hypophysis and the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, and I think that's in your figure maybe 14.4, is the hypothalamus. You'll see that there. Controls the pituitary function. And you know, I told you the pituitary is the master gland. And that is controlled then by the hypothalamus, which is in the brain also. So those are right there together if you'll see on 14.1. So the hypothalamus controls the pituitary function. And it is connected to the anterior pituitary through capillaries and to the posterior pituitary through tissue extension. But what you need to know is the hypothalamus controls the pituitary. Okay? And it does that by releasing hormones. There are specific releasing hormones for each hormone of the anterior pituitary. So there's different hormones for the anterior. There are specific releasing hormones for the posterior pituitary. And example, there's one called corticotropin releasing hormone. It stimulates the release of ACTH by the anterior pituitary. And so, again, it's amazing how the body knows through something that tiny what kind of hormone to release. Now be sure and read the notes on this. So the pituitary gland has two parts. It has, as we said, the anterior and the posterior. It's controlled by releasing hormones of what? The hypothalamus. Okay? The hormones of the anterior pituitary, now this is the anterior part, are composed of granular epithelial tissues. And these are TSH, with thyroid stimulating, ACTH, growth hormone, gonadotropins, which is in the gonads, and prolactin. Now, you can remember these through the acronym PRO, athletes got to grow. Prolactin, ACTH, gonadotropins, thyroid stimulating, and growth. PRO, athletes got to grow. You need to memorize that. I'm just telling you. And the growth hormone, and all of that is on 264 right now. Read the Sum It Up on that page. Read the Do You Know on that page. And know that chart, Pro Athletes Got to Grow. You need to know all of that. Very important slide. The anterior growth hormone is called somatropin. It affects the bones, cartilage. It causes amino acids to build into the proteins and fats to be used for energy. It converts protein to glucose, and I will let you read all the rest of that. The anterior is called prolactin. I will let you know. Entropic hormones, adenocorticotropic hormone, gonadotropic hormones, thyroid stimulating. Those are what we just talked about. You need to read about each one of those. I cannot go over all of those in this as our time is fleeting. Posterior pituitary gland, we just talked about that, and that's the antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. I think I have a video on the ADH, antidiuretic. So what does that mean? That means you're not going to lose fluid. So when you're diuresing or you're losing fluid, then and you're losing too much, the posterior pituitary will kick into gear, and it will secrete a hormone called ADH, antidiuretic, and it will slow that release of loss of fluid in your body. And oxytocin we already talked about with babies. So the anterior antidiuretic hormone, as I said, is to conserve water. Its primary target, remember, now all hormones have a primary target. So its target is the kidney. So it's going to go in there and say, okay, we need to conserve water. In the absence, if you don't have enough antidiuretic hormone, you're going to get what they call, if you're diabetic, diabetes insipidus. You need to know that term, diabetes insipidus. And if you get a patient in with diabetes insipidus, They are pouring urine, and so dangerous in so many ways, diabetes insipidus. And so you will, the hospital will be giving them antidiuretic hormones to slow that down. It causes blood vessels then to constrict and elevate the blood pressure, so it's often given if blood pressure is low, all kinds of things. The posterior pituitary, again, we talked about oxytocin, and you can read that. The thyroid is the, actually, I think I'm going to stop here and load this one and start on a third video.